Thanks, David. And just in the interest of transparency, I have a disclosure to make, and that is that I've had to learn all about HealthCheck. I haven't ever worked directly with HealthCheck. And I'm based in Vancouver, where the primary part of the HealthCheck program was the restaurant program, which I'm not really going to talk much about today. So just so you know, and I've planted those seeds of mistrust, you can consider how much to take my word as the truth, the gospel truth. So HealthCheck, how many people are familiar with HealthCheck here? Oh, almost everybody. Okay, so some of you probably know more about it than I do. HealthCheck was a front-of-pack label program. It was launched in 1999, and we wound it up at the end of 2014. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the journey that HealthCheck took, which was a small part of a much larger journey that Dennis and Roxy have both talked about in terms of shifts in the culture of food that are shaping a lot of the discourse that people here are talking about. So we know that food, of course, is important for how we live. It's not just important for keeping us alive, but it's also important for the quality of life. How we eat, what we eat, affects how we live. And a lot of that has started about 60, or our knowledge of that started about 60 or 70 years ago with this guy, Ancel Keys, who, among other things, wrote this book with his wife, Eat Well, Stay Well, which I was surprised to learn in doing some research for this presentation, is actually still in publication. Although you can actually get original copies off Amazon for quite a steep price, so it's a collector's item. But people still read this book. So Ancel Keys, as most of you probably know, laid the foundations for most of what we know about dietary fats and cholesterol. Or at least he laid the foundations for most of what we thought we know about dietary fats and cholesterol. And that seems, in the very recent past, to change. So things are changing at a fairly rapid rate. Another guy that helped us learn about the relationship between how we live and how we eat is this guy, Louis Dahl, who in the 1970s, based on animal studies and population studies, said he confirmed the relationship between sodium and hypertension. However, even now, that's actually up for debate. And at the upcoming Canadian Cardiovascular Congress in October in Toronto, there's going to be a debate between the Heart and Stroke CIHR Chair in Hypertension, Norm Campbell, and Salim Yousuf about the actual contribution of sodium to hypertension. That'll be very interesting to see. So getting on to HealthCheck itself, HealthCheck was created, as I mentioned, it was launched in 1999 as a front-of-pack program, eventually adding a suite of communication, a whole suite of communication and support tools. And while it operated, it was the only neutral third-party, not-for-profit food information program in Canada. So basically, HealthCheck came along at a time when there was front-of-pack programs operating in the UK and Australia and the US, and I think a couple in Northern Europe. And in the US in particular, the American Heart Association had the HealthCheck program, which has a very similar logo. Heart and Stroke Canada was actually inspired by the program in Australia, and we wanted to use the Australian model with one key exception, as I'll mention later. So the key principle of HealthCheck was to improve the health of Canadians by changing the food supply with incentives from both the demand and the supply side. On the demand side, to highlight for consumers the best of what was available in the food supply, and from the supply side by encouraging producers to provide more healthier options for consumers. There was a technical advisory committee composed of dietitians and other nutrition experts that helped develop the criteria based on Canada's food guide. and the determination of a product's qualification was done through eventually computerized algorithms that varied depending on the food group and the food subgroup. The HealthCheck logo was licensed to companies which submitted products for analysis by heart and stroke dietitians, and these were verified by an independent lab. We did random checks to ensure compliance with criteria, and also annual licensing was charged for cost recovery of the program. HSF didn't make any surplus on HealthCheck, so it wasn't actually a revenue generator. However, as I'll note later, and many of you probably know, that did become problematic for the program. So there were some initial challenges in launching the program. We launched it, and as I said, in 1999. There was about 2.5 years of work in preparing the program for that launch. Initially, there was some regulatory challenges. My understanding is that the initial group that was implementing HealthCheck wanted to do a 1-check, 2-check, 3-step check program, kind of like the guiding stars or the green light, amber light, red light type programs, but that was not allowed by Health Canada because it implied a health claim. And we also had some problems in terms of stakeholder buy-in. And this is where we differed from the Australian model. In Australia, they basically developed the program, and then they launched it. They didn't actually go out and talk to companies at all. So we wanted to get industry buy-in prior to launching the program. So for a couple of years, people from HealthCheck made the rounds, going from office to office, trying to convince people to participate in a program for which at this point there was virtually no brand recognition. And it was a hard slog trying to convince people companies to actually produce something create something or pay for something that they had no idea whether they were going to get any benefit from. And then there was some early pushback from both sides in the debate on nutrition. Some people thought the criteria were not stringent enough. Other people thought they were far too stringent. And in fact, only about 10%, at the time in terms of the market research, only about 10% of the products actually met the HealthCheck criteria. So it was a bit of a tough sell. And also, some companies wanted exclusivity. They only wanted their brand to have, in a particular category, to have the HealthCheck symbol. Of course, this wasn't a marketing program for companies. It was a tool to show healthy food choices, so we couldn't go in that direction. And actually, there was one company, apparently, that actually wanted us to pay them to display the HealthCheck logo, because the logo plus the nutrition facts table, which actually wasn't mandatory at this point, took up a lot of real estate on the package. And so their reasoning was, you want us to display your logo, you should give us some benefit for it, direct benefit, because we're not going to get anything out of it. However, the foundation did manage to overcome a lot of those, and it launched successfully in 1999, and it had some, I think, impressive achievements. For one thing, the nutrition facts table wasn't mandatory when HealthCheck launched in 1999, so it prefigured the mandatory NFT, which actually was passed in 2003, I believe, and then implemented at the end of 2005. And at that point, that's when HealthCheck actually started to really grow. It had been a bit of a slow go at first, but ultimately there was 2,000 products in HealthCheck, 200 licensed brands included in food groups, in all food groups, and the restaurant program had items in 700 restaurant outlets across the country. So a lot of companies that were participated actually reformulated their existing products, or they developed new products to meet HealthCheck criteria. And by 2011, HealthCheck participants had removed 800,000 tons of salt from their products, which is equivalent to about 20 dump trucks of salt. That's quite I think quite an achievement. And then in terms of brand awareness, 86% of Canadians recognize the HealthCheck logo. And the HealthCheck website actually was a bit of a pioneer in this area in terms of online and social media. We added blogs fairly early on, not just to the website, but they were also on Canada.com and on Huffington Post. We pioneered the use of social media, including Facebook and Twitter, and there was also recipes and online tools and tips. And actually the recipe section still continues to be popular, and we've migrated that. Once we wound down HealthCheck, we migrated that over to the Foundation website, and it is still an extremely popular, highly trafficked area of our website. So I guess the question is, despite all this, we wound HealthCheck down in 2014. So the question is, what happened? Why did we change things? And I just want to, I'm actually going to deviate from our standard messaging here, and our communications people will probably not be happy with me. I'd just like to tell a couple of stories from my own life experience, because I'm pushing 60. I really love to cook. But 30 years ago, I hated cooking. I was mostly interested in craft dinner. I mean, that was pretty easy to make, and food did not play a really large part in my life the way it does now. And so I think I'm a bit of an example of some of the things that other folks here have been talking about and will talk about. So about 30 years ago, when I met the woman who is now my wife, she had, anybody remember this book? Yes. And this one? So when I first met my now wife, Joanne, she had both these books on her bookshelf in the kitchen, and I came along and we started cooking. The Moosewood Cookbook and the Enchanted Broccoli Forest came out in the 1970s, and they were popular with university students in the late 70s and early 80s. And they were the first sort of mass market vegetarian cookbooks. And so we got together, and she would make meals out of these books all the time. And for me, they were really exotic. They were like, whoa, what is this stuff? It's tofu. Ooh. So it took me a long time to get used to this, and eventually I started cooking out of these cookbooks too. Now, you know, as we got more and more into food, I started trying cooking other stuff, and then we had kids that came along, and you know how things go. So we didn't really use these books for a lot of years, and then recently Joanne has started cooking out of them again. And you know, the thing about them now is if you follow the recipes in this book, they are really bland. They are boring, frankly, if you ask me. And I think that says something about how palates have changed in the last 30 or 40 years. So people want things that are more interesting, more varied. These books were designed at a time when people were not used to a really broad range of cooking, a broad range of foods, and doing a really interesting thing with food. So they were exotic at one time, but no longer. So the second story, and this also happened when we first got together, is one morning, she woke me up. It's October, it's Vancouver, it was pouring rain out, just pelting down rain. And she said, we're going to go pick rocks at the old city dump. And I'm like, what are you talking about? She says, no, come on, it'll be fun, it'll be fun. I said, it's pouring rain out, we can't do that. So I just want to show you what the old city dump, this is the original city dump in Vancouver, and this is what it looks like now. This is Strathcona Community Gardens. It was the first community garden in Vancouver. And it's still there. We have a plot. We live about 4 blocks away from there. The thing is, that was the first one. That was started in 1985. It's when we went down to pick those rocks out of that dump. And we did have the soil tested, so don't worry. It doesn't have any heavy metals in it. And so this is how many community gardens there are in Vancouver now. This is a city map. So there's been this exponential growth in interest in growing food. So And you know, it's not just in Vancouver. I'm using Vancouver because that's where I'm from. But Toronto, other cities, Heart and Stroke in BC is partnered with the First Nations Health Authority, where we've been working with 25 First Nations communities on developing community gardens and greenhouses. And I actually know from that experience, because we're networking with First Nations communities across the country who are interested in gardening. In Vancouver, there's actually commercial gardening operations in the city using people's yards, front yards and backyards, and also parking lots using raised beds and vertical gardening and parking lots. There's an outfit called Soul Food that works with ex-cons and actually produces commercial. It's a commercial operation. So there's been some pretty significant changes, and I'm just going to go back here. There's been a major shift in the way we think and talk about food. And I think that's evidenced by this guy. Love him or hate him, and I think there's probably, he's certainly provoked a lot of discourse about how we eat, about the ethics and the morality of how people eat food, and I think that's evidenced by the avalanche of books that he's written, which have all been bestsellers. And then you have things like this thing, the Food Channel. How many people watch the Food Channel? Ooh, not very many. I actually don't have cable, so I don't watch it very often, usually when I'm at a friend's place. What I think is really interesting about this is that if you actually look at that page, there's one woman and six guys on this is the home page, one woman and six guys on a channel devoted to food. When I grew up, the only guy on TV talking about food was the Galloping Gourmet, and we all used to make jokes about him. And his audience was almost entirely composed of women. And if you go to the actual programs page, there's the hosts of the show. There's 28 male hosts and only 11 female hosts. So cooking is something that's infused the culture now, and it's everywhere, and even men do it. That's probably because it's become competitive. The other thing is, and these are just examples, I could give dozens of these things, is the sort of rise of, I guess, what you could call the local food movement in North America. And actually, the upcoming issue of Fortune magazine has an article about farmers markets. Over the last 20 years, farmers markets have grown by 400%. The number of farmers markets. That's just in the U.S. I don't have any Canadian figures. And it's a $11.5 billion industry now in the United States. And then there's actually a global analog. I don't know if people are familiar with La Via Campesina, which is kind of a global peasants' rights movement that's sort of like grow local, buy local, that kind of thing. And it's got affiliates in Canada and Western Europe. And now we're in a situation where the food guide, the Canada Food Guide, we're told that it's too complicated and that Canada should be adopting something that's more like the Brazilian Food Guide, which is, 10 easy steps, basically. And so, so this is the context in which we now have 30 million experts in nutrition. And so everybody's got an opinion, whether they know really the facts or they're basing it on their values. And so in that context, this is what happened with HealthCheck. By the second half of the 2000s, HealthCheck was operating in a very different environment than the one in which it had started. I don't know if people saw this in 2008. It was cringeworthy, made us all kind of cringe. It was a bit of ambush journalism. But what it did is it signaled to us that you can't just say you're doing a great job and talk about the great job you're doing. I think this is something that Roxy brought up. You have to actually walk the walk and talk the talk. And so in some ways, HealthCheck got in on the early stages of this cultural revolution, and perhaps it even helped propel it along in a small way. But the sea change also accelerated, or things also accelerated, so that eventually HealthCheck began to look a bit out of step with what it contributed to creating. So this is what we got by 2008. And at the same time, the Heart and Stroke had been moving to a much more focused, much sharper position on nutrition. So we were putting out position statements on sodium, I can't even read that. I need new glasses. Anyway, on schools and nutrition, on healthy eating, marketing to kids, on sugar and produce consumption. So at the same time as we were saying healthier is not good enough, healthiest is the best, we were basically working to create healthier options, but not the healthiest options in the food supply. And we were also working with a number of other organizations on the Mix It Up campaign, and now the extension of that campaign, Half Your Plate. So what are some of the lessons that we learned? First of all, actually, this is supposed to say regulation matters. One of the first big lessons was that when the nutrition facts table became mandatory, that really boosted participation in HealthCheck from companies. The second is there's a proliferation of front-of-pack systems. I think Mary LeBay counted 158 different front-of-pack labels in Canada alone, which covered about 18% of products on supermarket shelves. So we were just one of a whole bunch of front-of-pack programs. And even though we had 86% brand recognition, after a while, it's hard to cut through all that noise. Second, simple is better. For two reasons, I think. One is that it's very difficult to explain a complicated computerized algorithm that determines which foods are eligible for a program and which foods aren't eligible for a program. And also the relationship between the label and the organizational brand is paramount. As we were putting out position statements, which were much more focused, we also were still pursuing HealthCheck, and as the label program starts to become subject to criticism, it starts to undermine the trust in the actual organizational brand, and so you have to make a decision. What direction are you going to go in? In fact, you need to make sure that the program doesn't undermine the trust that the brand has built up over time. It needs to be aligned with the underlying values of the brand itself. Okay, and then finally, context matters. Of course, as I just finished talking about, HealthCheck eventually was outpaced by developments and by consumer expectation, and you always have to be on top of that consumer expectation, even as it's changing at an increasingly rapid rate. Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks for that presentation. My question is, I didn't put my hand up when you talked about the food channel, partly because I don't have TV at home, but I have watched it, and what struck me was that there's lots of content about cooking and food preparation, but very little content about nutrition. And if Roxy's correct in saying consumers want that sort of information, why can't entities like CFI or Heart and Stroke try to position programs on what I gather is very well received and a very popular source of information? Why couldn't there be an initiative to try to embody more nutrition information into that programming?
That's a very good question. I don't know why there couldn't be. I hadn't thought of that before, but that is the kind of thing that really I think a lot of organizations, I mean, there's a whole group I was talking to Leah earlier about we were talking about how it's really important to bring health organizations, all kinds of health organizations in on this, because the risk factors for chronic disease cut across all these organizations. But nutrition, physical activity, cancer, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular, and so that it really is something that I think we should consider. It's a great idea.
It probably relates to profit creation, and as someone pointed out, the closer you are to profit, the the less the trust. But it would be great if there could be some mechanism to improve the communication of nutrition messaging through a conduit like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Paula Dean is a host on the Food Channel, so that says a lot about nutrition, the nutrition content of the food. But my point was that food is becoming so central culturally. I mean, it's always sort of central culturally, but it's becoming so central to our cultural that there's actually a channel entirely devoted to cooking.
How does Heart and Stroke measure the impact of their nutrition messaging? How do you know if you're making a difference?
You know what? That's a really good question, and that's something we're working on as we develop a new nutrition strategy. We want to develop something that's actually measurable. With HealthCheck, the impact was really, okay, so we removed 800 tons of sodium from the food supply. That's great, but how do you relate that to the overall level of sodium in the food supply, and did that really make a difference to sodium consumption? So we're actually looking at developing a nutrition strategy that's going to be measurable within a foreseeable time frame.
So I'm going to share with you part of the story that I was familiar with when that busted, the marketplace
Great.
story broke. My name's Mary Jo. I work for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. I have a nutrition background, but at the time it was really interesting to me what had happened. I live in Toronto, and my daughter was at a daycare, and she came home one day with a box of Vachon from her daycare that had been given to her. It was a box of a Vachon cookie thing that was covered in chocolate, and it came in a really cute carrying case, and it had a cartoon coloring book inside, and they had given it away to all the kids at the daycare for free. So she came home, and she was really excited, and she said, "Mom, look what I got from my daycare." And I said, "Oh my God, I can't believe they would give that to you." And so, of course, at the time, I was working in public health, and our health department was very concerned about direct marketing to children, using, cartoon characters to promote different foods. And this product bore a HealthCheck logo on it. Mm-hmm. So interestingly, I was at a neighborhood party not long after, and one of my neighbors, who also had a child at the daycare, who also was given this package to take home, started talking to me about it, and she was horrified. Well, it turns out she worked for Marketplace. So within a few days, I got a call from another Marketplace producer asking me to speak on television about this. And I said, well, actually, I don't want to go after the Heart and Stroke, because I know that, what they're trying to do is actually promote healthy eating despite the challenges. But I did voice my strong concerns about this particular incident. I also spoke to the daycare, of course, that I know they felt they were doing a nice thing for the kids. They didn't understand all the issues around this. But all to say that there was a couple issues with, and that company was actually later sued in Quebec, and they had to pay a large fine for promoting their products to daycares, because they were violating the Quebec Consumer Protection Act at that time as well. So there was a couple issues at play there. But I think that HealthCheck really left themselves with a big, there was a big bullseye on them, because the criteria at that time for the program really hadn't been modified, to keep step with really healthy. And I think it raised a whole bunch of issues about, how do we define healthy food? While you do say it's simple, it's not actually that simple. It's very complicated, as we all know. And I think that, there were many things about HealthCheck at that time that really left it vulnerable to that sort of expose that was really damaging, I think, to the HealthCheck brand, to health and stroke in general, and to health organizations that try to promote healthier eating. So I think it was really unfortunate at the time.
I love that story. I don't know if anybody in the foundation actually knows that, but I'm going to let people know. Thanks for that. And
I know you guys have gone through big changes. I had told Stephen Samus that story many years ago. So.
That's and you're absolutely right. I mean, that was pretty clear at that point, and that wasn't the only thing of questionable nutritional value that had a HealthCheck logo on it. And so when we looked at what actually it would take to tighten up the criteria, it made more sense for us, given the fact that we are campaigning now against marketing food and beverages to kids, for stricter sodium requirements, and now sugar. With our recent sugar position statement, it made more sense for us to actually wind HealthCheck down rather than having to go through the whole process of narrowing the criteria. Thanks.